Hey everyone, welcome back to Conviction Bet. Hope you're doing well because the market is not. The Fed held rates this afternoon, and 3 members of the committee dissented they wanted a hike. Long yields pushed higher after the decision, and a lot of the commentary read that as investors questioning whether the Fed is moving forcefully enough on inflation. The Dow had its worst day since April of 2025, and the NASDAQ 100 closed in correction territory, more than 10% below its June peak, with the broader composite not far behind. All of it inside the busiest week of earnings season, with about a third of the S&P 500 reporting. If your feed has been unreadable since Monday, that's why. And speaking of things that should have moved the tape more than they did, Apple passed NVIDIA on Monday to become the most valuable company in the world and briefly touched $5 trillion on Tuesday before closing back below it in the same month. Chip stocks are heading for one of their worst on record. So the winning AI trade this month was being the company everyone spent 2 years saying had missed AI. But here's what actually matters. The headline on this earnings season is 38%. That's the blended growth rate for second quarter profits across the S&P 500. Take Alphabet out of the Index 1 company, whose quarter included an accounting gain of roughly $98 billion, and the number falls to about 26. The Fed held this afternoon, and 3 people on the committee wanted to hike. And in the May reading, the most recent one we have, national saving came in at 3% of disposable income. $704 billion at an annual rate against a long-run average since 1959 of 8.4%. Nobody is going to lead a broadcast with that last one. But for someone still building a financial life, it may be the one with the most direct line to whether any of the rest of it survives. The market is telling a story about what you should own. The real story is about whether you will still own it. I'm J.L. Maurer, and this is Conviction Bet. We believe the stories that move your portfolio are usually quieter than the ones that move the tape. Here's where we're going. I want to make the case that for most people still in the accumulation phase, the number that matters most is not this year's return, and it is not a minor allocation change. It's the share of your income you consistently don't spend, because that number is one of the strongest determinants of whether a shock can turn you into a forced seller. I'll show you the research that says keeping up with your neighbors doesn't just land you a nicer car, it lands on your balance sheet as leverage in riskier holdings. And I'll show you the arithmetic that says at a 3% savings rate, a full year of work buys you about 11 days of not working. Let's start with 2 people who never met. The first is Ronald Read. He grew up in Dummerston, Vermont, hitchhiked to high school, and was the first person in his family to graduate from one. He served in the Army in the Second World War. He came home to Brattleboro in 1945 and pumped gas for about 25 years. Then he retired for exactly 1 year, got bored, and took a part-time job as a janitor at JCPenney, where he worked another 17 years until 1997. He wore flannel shirts. He cut his own firewood. He drove a secondhand Toyota Yaris. His lawyer told reporters that the last time he came to our office, he parked far away in a spot with no meters to save the coins. Ronald Read died on the 2nd of June, 2014, at 92 years old. His estate was worth about $8 million. In a safe deposit box, there was a stack of paper stock certificates, 5 inches thick, at least 95 different companies, most of them held for decades. He left $4.8 million to Brattleboro Memorial Hospital and $1.2 million to the Brooks Memorial Library, both the largest gifts either institution had ever received. His own stepson told the local paper that nobody had any idea he was a multimillionaire. The second person is Richard Fuscone. He was a Merrill Lynch executive. At one point, he ran the firm's Latin America business. He had an MBA. He made a 40 under 40 list. He retired from Merrill in his 40s to become a philanthropist. In the mid-2000s, he borrowed heavily to expand a house, 18,000 square feet, 11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 2 swimming pools, 6 fireplaces, a 7-car garage. Morgan Housel reports the upkeep alone ran more than $90,000 a month. He listed it for $13.9 million in November of 2009. No buyer, In April of 2010, days before a scheduled foreclosure auction, he filed for personal bankruptcy. In the filing, he stated that he had no income for the coming 30-day period. And here is the detail I cannot get out of my head. The list of creditors in that bankruptcy filing included American Express and Mercedes-Benz, and a private school, and also the local hardware store, a pet store, a clothing shop in town. A man with a $13 million house owing money to the pet store. The house eventually sold at foreclosure in 2014. Housel reports it went for about 75% less than an insurance company had figured it was worth. Housel notes that sale came about 5 months before Ronald Read's fortune went to charity. Now, I want to be careful about what this pair of stories does and does not prove. It is not a claim that janitors are better investors than bankers. One anecdote against one anecdote proves nothing about averages, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What it does establish is narrower and stranger. It establishes that the range of outcomes in this field is wide enough to contain both of those people. In almost every other domain, that doesn't happen. A man who has never studied medicine does not outperform a Harvard-trained cardiologist. A man who is never trained as a structural engineer does not build a better bridge. Finance is unusually tolerant of a gap between credentials and outcomes. Formal knowledge matters. It just doesn't protect anyone from leverage, overspending, bad incentives, or an inability to stay invested. Which tells you something about where to point your attention. I can't isolate one cause from two lives. Income, luck, longevity, family circumstance, and portfolio construction all differ between them, and two anecdotes cannot rank those. But the most visible financial difference is not credentials. Read combined low spending, a very long holding period, and no apparent leverage. Fuscone built a liability structure that could not survive an interruption in income. So the thing worth auditing this quarter is probably not your research process. It's your liabilities and your liquidity. So here's where it gets interesting. I want to give you a way to hold this that I think is more useful than be disciplined. Think about the brakes on a car. If you describe brakes on a spec sheet, they look like a pure negative. They are a device whose entire function is to reduce your speed. They add weight. They add cost. They convert momentum into waste heat. And yet, no engineer on earth would describe brakes as the thing that makes a car slow. Brakes are the reason a car can go fast. Take them off and you don't get a faster car. You get a car that can only be driven at speeds you're willing to crash at. Cash in a portfolio is brakes. Not an anchor. Brakes. And I don't just mean that as a nice image. This is close to word for word how Housel describes his own money, which is worth hearing because he is unusually specific about it for someone in his position. Cash and bonds get filed under conservatism, under not wanting to take risk. He argues that's backwards. What they actually do is let the stocks you own sit untouched and uninterrupted so they can compound. His own allocation, as he has described it, index funds, cash, a house with no mortgage on it, and shares in one company where he sits on the board. That, in his telling, is the core of the household balance sheet. And he has put the cash at somewhere around a fifth of his investment holdings. That's how he described it in 2020. Personal allocations move, and he has been explicit that it is not a recommendation for anyone else. His stated reason is that he wants to be able to absorb a worst-case financial shock, a job loss, a roof, a change of heart about private school, and get through it without selling a single share. Because if the shares survive 30 or 40 or 50 years untouched, that's where the extraordinary money is. He has a line for the whole posture. Save like a pessimist, invest like an optimist. Pessimism about the next 18 months, optimism about the next 30 years, same person, different time horizons. And that combination is rarer than it sounds, which brings me to the best illustration of it I know. When Bill Gates founded Microsoft, he set out what may be the single most aggressive bet in modern business history. There should be a computer on every desk and in every home. At the time, that was not ambition. It was closer to a hallucination. And Housel tells the other half this way. In Microsoft's early years, Gates wanted enough cash in the bank to make payroll for 12 full months, even if no revenue came in at all. Sit with that for a second. the most optimistic possible view of the destination, and a balance sheet built for the world ending next Tuesday. He did not average those two positions into something moderate. He held both at full strength and assigned each one a time horizon. You can see the same shape in the compounding numbers everyone quotes and nobody quite absorbs. Through the end of 2024, Berkshire's per share market value had compounded at 19.9% a year since 1965 against 10.4% for the S&P 500 with dividends. That's the skill. But run Housel's counterfactual on it. Take Buffett's actual historical return and hand it to a normal person, someone who kicked around in his 20s, arrived at 30 with $25,000, and then retired at 60. Housel calculates that person ends up worth roughly $12 million. Buffett, at the time the book was written, was worth $84.5 billion. Same skill, different runway. He handed the chief executive job to Greg Abel on the 1st of January this year and stayed on as chairman. He is 95 and still goes into the office 5 days a week. And the institution he built is running that same barbell right now at a scale that makes the point almost uncomfortable. Berkshire closed the first quarter of this year holding a record $397 billion in cash and short-term treasuries. Roughly $52 billion of that is actual cash. The rest is short-term treasury bills. It is more than a third of the entire company's market value, and it comes after 14 straight quarters of selling more stock than it bought a streak. Greg Abel has not broken. Now, a conglomerate's balance sheet is not a household's, and I am not suggesting you hold 59% cash. But the most celebrated equity investor in history built an institution that is currently paying an enormous opportunity cost for optionality in public on purpose. Two honest caveats before the implication. One, I've been using the word cash loosely, and it isn't one thing. An emergency fund that covers your rent is doing a different job from a treasury sleeve inside a portfolio, and both are different from dry powder held for opportunities. Two, cash really does compete with equity returns. That is a genuine cost, not a free option. So the implication is not hold cash because cash is safe. It's that the cost buys something specific, a lower probability that an interruption in your income forces you to sell equities at the worst possible moments. You're not choosing between 3% and 10%. You're paying a lower blended return for a longer holding period. And for most people, the second is worth more than it looks on the spreadsheets. Now, let's talk about the number that sets all of this, because I've been circling it. The Bureau of Economic Analysis publishes the personal saving rate every month. And I need to be precise about what it is, because almost everyone who quotes it gets this wrong. It is an aggregate, total personal saving across the country divided by total disposable income. It is not the savings rate of a typical household. It does not mean the average American earns $100 and deliberately sets $3 aside. High earners and low earners contribute very differently to both halves of that fraction. With that said, in the May reading, it was 3%. April, as currently reported, was also 3%. A year ago, it was running closer to 4.5%. And these numbers get revised. April was first published at 2.6 and then revised up. So treat the whole sequence as the latest estimate rather than gospel. The average on that series since 1959 is 8.4%. Its low was 1.4% in July of 2005, at the peak of the housing bubble, when people were pulling equity out of their homes to fund consumption. Its high was 31.8% in April of 2020. When nobody could leave the house. So we're running at roughly a third of the long-run norm. And I want to be straight with you about the shape of this, because it is not a one-way street. This series is cyclical. It averaged 3.4% across all of 2022 and then recovered to 5.6% the year after. So the national number is not destiny, and nothing I'm about to say depends on the trend continuing. It depends only on where that number sits for you. I want to translate that into something you can feel, because a percentage does not land. So here's the arithmetic, and this is a hypothetical about you, not a reading of the national number. Suppose your own after-tax savings rate were 3%. Ignore investment returns entirely for a moment. Just do the raw division. If you earn 100 and save 3, you're spending 97. 1 year of your spending costs 97, and you're setting aside 3 a year to cover it. 97 divided by 3 is about 32. On that deliberately simplified no return calculation, 32 years of work funds, 1 year of your current spending. Turn it around. Every year you work buys you about 11 days. Run the same division at the long run average of 8.4%, and 1 year of work buys you about 33 days. 3 times as much from a 5.5 point change in one number. Now, that arithmetic is deliberately crude. It ignores compounding, which pushes hard in your favor over decades. It ignores taxes and Social Security, and it assumes your future cost of living stays proportional to what you spend now. It's a visualization, not a retirement forecast. But it isolates something real, and it's the reason I keep coming back to this number instead of to allocation. Your savings rate is one of the few levers that moves the numerator and the denominator at the same time. Every recurring dollar of spending you remove does 2 jobs. It becomes a dollar available to save, and it lowers the annual cost of the life your assets eventually have to fund. A one-off purchase you skip only does the first. It's the recurring cut that works from both ends. There are others in that family paying off a mortgage, killing recurring debt service, raising your income without raising your spending. What they share is that they change the size of the life your assets eventually have to fund. Picking a better fund never does that. And this is where I'd push back on how the whole subject gets taught. Investing is a hard skill. There's real technical content, reading a cash flow statement, understanding what a multiple is actually claiming, knowing the difference between an accounting charge and money leaving the building. You can study it and get measurably better. Much of everyday personal finance is different, a behavioral problem wrapped around a technical core. There is real analysis in it: taxes, insurance, debt structure, estate work. But people often keep adding analysis when the constraint that's actually left is implementation. So here's the practical implication, and I want to bound it properly. This is strongest early in the accumulation phase, when what you add each year is still large relative to what you already own. For someone with a $5 million portfolio and $100,000 of income, or a retiree drawing down, the balance flips, the portfolio dominates the contributions, and allocation, fees, and taxes matter more. But for many people early in the accumulation phase, a sustained 3-point increase in the savings rate likely does more for the outcome than fine-tuning an already diversified allocation. But that raises the obvious question, and I don't want to skip it. Where does the money actually go? Because just spend less is useless advice, and I'm not going to give it. What's more useful is knowing that not all spending is the same transaction, and the neuroscience here is genuinely clarifying. Kent Berridge and Terry Robinson are neuroscientists at the University of Michigan. They spent decades on a question that sounds like wordplay and isn't. Is wanting something the same process as liking it? Berridge assumed yes. Most people assume yes. The answer turned out to be no. Wanting and liking turn out to be separable, supported by partly different systems in the brain. Dopamine is central to the wanting, the pursuit, the anticipation, the pull toward the thing rather than to the pleasure of actually having it. That's a smaller, more fragile system, and dopamine appears far more central to the pursuit than to the pleasure you get on arrival. They published the theory in 1993 against the consensus of the time and shared the Grawemeyer Award in Psychology for it in 2019, which means the two can come apart. You can be built to want something you will not enjoy. That is not a character flaw, that's architecture. Now, that research does not sort your purchases for you. The next part is my framework, not their finding. But once you have the distinction, a whole category of spending gets easier to see. There is spending that produces surplus, you're above the line, and the purchase adds something. And there is spending that fills a hole you felt behind or squeezed or invisible, and the purchase moved you back to zero. Both can feel like relief in the moment. Only one of them tends to leave anything behind once the relief fades. One way to hold this that I find useful: Pleasure purchases behave like an ability with a long cooldown. Use it once and it works. Use it again immediately and you get almost nothing because the baseline has already moved up. The $5,000 version thrilled you in March. By December, it's the floor, and the thrill now costs $10. And the research on where money reliably does convert into well-being is more interesting than the version that circulates. You've probably heard that happiness plateaus above $75,000 of income. That came from Kahneman and Deaton in 2010. Then in 2021, Matthew Killingsworth ran it again with a different method, pinging people in real time instead of asking them to recall a day, and found no plateau at all. Two respected researchers flatly contradicting each other. What happened next is the good part. Instead of trading rebuttals for a decade, they reanalyzed Killingsworth's experience sampling data together with a third researcher, Barbara Mellers, and published the result in 2023 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the resolution is this. For most people, well-being keeps rising with income well past $100,000. And for the happiest group, it accelerates. The flattening was real, but only for the least happy group. Read that carefully and note what it is and isn't. These are associations between income and reported well-being, not proof that money caused any particular feeling. But the pattern is consistent with something we're sitting with. Among the least happy people, income above roughly $100,000 stop tracking with feeling better. Some kinds of misery do not appear to be relieved by more money. There is one category, though, where the evidence is unusually clean. In 2017, Ashley Willens and colleagues surveyed more than 6,200 adults across the United States, Canada, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and found that people who spend money on time-saving services report higher life satisfaction. Then they ran a field experiment to get at causation, and working adults were happier after a purchase that bought them time than after a purchase that bought them an object. And here's the part that should stop you. In a sample of more than 800 millionaires, nearly half reported spending nothing at all on outsourcing tasks they disliked. In another, smaller sample, asked how they'd use a hypothetical $40 windfall, 2% chose something that would save them time. 2% in that sample on that question. One of the cleanest experimental findings we have on turning discretionary money into well-being, and in these samples, it looks badly underused, including by the people who could most easily afford it. So the implication for a serious investor is that spending deserves the same treatment as a portfolio. You already accept that two assets with identical prices can have wildly different expected returns. Two purchases at the same price are no different. One converts to durable well-being. One is a hole-filling exercise you'll repeat next month, and the price tag tells you nothing about which is which. Now, let's talk about who's setting your baseline, because it probably isn't you. This is the part of the topic that usually gets handled as moral instruction. Don't keep up with the Joneses, envy is bad, and so on. I want to do something harder, which is to show you the number. There's a paper by Sumit Agarwal, Vyacheslav Mikhead, and Barry Sholnick published in the Review of Financial Studies in January of 2020. Earlier version out of the Philadelphia Fed. The design is beautiful, and it works because of a quirk of Canadian geography. A Canadian 6-digit postal code contains a median of 13 households that is smaller than a city block. So the researchers took the universe of lottery winners in one Canadian province, 7,377 prizes between 2004 and 2014, matched them to the universe of bankruptcy filings, and asked a very precise question. When one household on your block gets a random windfall, what happens to the neighbors who got nothing? Answer, they go bankrupt more often. A win equal to the median annual income in the sample, about 29,000 Canadian dollars, was associated with an increase of roughly 6.6% in the expected number of bankruptcies in that postal code over the following 2 years, measured against its own baseline. Not 6.5 percentage points on any one neighbor's odds. 6.5% more filings on a small base. Over 5 years, about 14%. $100,000 prize, about 11% in 2 years. But the mechanism is where this gets uncomfortable, because they could read the bankruptcy balance sheets The bigger the neighbors win, the more the bankrupt households had tied up in visible assets, houses, and cars. No effect on the invisible ones. Furniture, nothing. Recreational equipment, nothing. The spending tracked what could be seen from the street. And the authors are careful here. They can't observe when any of it was bought, so they call this evidence consistent with conspicuous consumption rather than proof of it. That's the right amount of caution. It doesn't blunt the point. And then the finding that made me want to build an episode around this. The larger the neighbors win, the more securities showed up on those bankruptcy balance sheets. Risky financial assets went up. Cash was unaffected. Insurance and pensions weekly went down, which means the households that ended up in bankruptcy court did not merely buy a nicer car. Their balance sheets showed more visible assets and some drift toward riskier financial holdings. The authors read that pattern as consistent with conspicuous consumption and greater risk-taking, and they are careful not to claim they observed anyone's motive or the order any of it happened in. I'd put it this way. Social comparison did not stay in the psychology department. It showed up on the asset side of a bankruptcy filing. And one more result, because it's the one people never mention. The researchers ran a placebo test on households slightly further out, same census area, a few blocks over, about 200 homes. They found no comparable statistically significant effect out there, which is not proof the true effect is exactly zero, but it does suggest the phenomenon fades within a couple of city blocks, which suggests the financially relevant comparison group is far more local than we imagine. In this study, the detectable spillover lived among the roughly 13 households sharing a postal code and largely vanished beyond it. Dryly, 13 households chosen for you by where you happen to sign a lease. If you want the extreme version, run it across generations. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January of 1877, holding somewhere around $100 million, reportedly more than the United States Treasury held at the time. Within a few generations, the family had largely disappeared from the very top ranks of American wealth. In 1973, about 120 family members gathered for a reunion at the university he had endowed, and the family historian Arthur Vanderbilt II later wrote that not one attendee was a millionaire. I take that as one author's account of the people in that room rather than a census of the bloodline. There were hundreds of living descendants who weren't there. The direction, though, is not in dispute, and there was no crash, no fraud, no single catastrophic night at the tables. Houses nobody lived in and yachts nobody sailed, plus division among heirs, taxes, divorce settlements, and some genuinely terrible management across 3 generations, competing for status inside a reference group of a few hundred families in New York. So the investment implication is direct, and it's not about envy. Your reference group can become an unpriced influence on your spending and your risk-taking. And unlike market returns, it's an influence you have some ability to edit by changing what and whom you repeatedly look at. Now, let's ask the question underneath all of it. What is any of this actually for? Housel's answer, and it's the line of his that has traveled furthest, is that the highest dividend money pays is control over your time. Not a bigger house, not a better car, control over the hours. He wrote a whole second book about that half of the equation, The Art of Spending Money, published last October by Portfolio. His central distinction is between 2 uses of a dollar. One is a tool for living a better life. The other is a measuring stick for comparing yourself to other people. Same dollar, completely different return. And he draws a line between being rich and being wealthy that I think is the most useful 2-word distinction in personal finance. Rich is easy to measure. You can count the objects. Wealthy is harder because what you're measuring is how much of your own life you control. One of those shows up in photographs. The other is almost by definition invisible, which is why the real arithmetic problem here is not about income at all. What determines how you feel is the distance between what you have and what you've come to expect. And expectations are not fixed. They can rise right alongside income, and often quietly enough that a raise delivers less additional freedom than you expected. Income arrives in visible steps, expectations reset without announcing themselves. And when every increase gets converted into recurring spending, the finish line moves forward with you. There's a cruel version of this that plays out constantly in high-paying professions. The work that pays well enough to buy your time back is frequently the work that consumes all of it. And the compensation for the hours is a lifestyle that then requires the hours. That's a closed loop, and the exit is not a bigger number. It's a lower burn rate. Notice, by the way, what the Willens paper actually opens with. The premise of that research is that rising incomes across the developed world have produced a rising sense of time scarcity. Rising income has not automatically translated into a greater sense of available time. That can happen for plenty of reasons: longer hours, more responsibility, or spending that creates new obligations. The useful point is narrower. Earning more and controlling more of your own time are not the same achievement. Now, I want to be fair to the other side, because there's a version of the savings argument that curdles into something unpleasant. Housel is pointedly not an evangelist for extreme frugality. The argument he actually makes in the new book is that there are two opposing truths you have to hold at the same time. Compound interest rewards patience and time, and life is fragile, and nobody sends you the schedule. Neither extreme honors both of those. Refusing to resolve the tension in either direction is, in his framing, the entire art of it. Which brings me to the most useful reframe I've come across on this, because it makes an abstract virtue computable. Save more is not an instruction anyone can act on. Two specific numbers are. The first is a floor for later. Whatever amount means that if you were forced to stop working permanently and against your will, you would not be destitute. You can calculate that number, and the moment it exists, every risk you take today gets cheaper because the downside finally has a floor under it. The second is runway now. Enough liquid reserve to survive a realistic interruption in income without being forced to sell long-term assets. Depending on how stable your income is, how many people depend on you, what your insurance covers, and what debt you carry, that might be a few months or it might be a year. The point isn't the number. The point is that on any given Tuesday, you are able to say no to the client, to the role, to the deal, to the promotion that costs more than it pays. And that's the reframe. Those two numbers are not sacrifice. They are the price of optionality, and optionality is what you were trying to buy the entire time. So here's the implication for how you hold a portfolio. The point of the compounding was never the terminal number on the statement. It's that at some identifiable date, the portfolio starts covering your expenses, and from that day forward, every hour of your life is a choice instead of an obligation. Which means the honest measure of progress is not your return this year. It's how many months of your own life you currently own outright. And now I have to steel man this because there's a real case against everything I've just told you. Two parts, and the second one is stronger than most people covering this subject realize. First, the cash drag is real, and it is not small. Over 6 decades, the money in this business was made by owning equities 19.9% a year at Berkshire against 10.4% for the index. Cash and treasury bills earned something over that stretch. They earned far less, which means a standing cash allocation carries a real compounding opportunity cost. Hold 20% in cash for 30 years, and you have measurably, calculably less money than the person who didn't. Telling people to hold cash is telling them to end up poorer. That is a legitimate concern. Second, and this is the one that should actually worry you. The most cited statistic behind the whole behavior beats allocation argument has just had its usual interpretation seriously challenged. Morningstar publishes an annual study on the gap between what funds return and what the average dollar invested in them actually earns. Their 2025 edition put it at 1.2 percentage points a year over the decade through December of 2024, 7% for investors against 8.2% for the funds. About 15% of the total return lost to bad timing. That number has done a lot of load-bearing work in behavioral finance commentary for years. I have used it In the Financial Analyst Journal in May of this year, John Fulkerson, Bradford Jordan, Timothy Riley, and Xing Yan re-examined the same sample and concluded that wealth-destroying bad timing costs investors about 1/10 of a percentage point a year. Not 1.2, 1/10. The 1.2 gap is real as a dollar-weighted calculation. It just isn't all a behavior tax. Most of it, they argue, is an artifact of how that calculation weights cash flows. It partly measures hindsight rather than any decision that changed anyone's wealth. And look, if the timing penalty is 1/10 of a point, then a lot of what gets said about investor psychology, including by me, is overstated. Anyone still quoting the full 1.2 as a pure behavior tax now owes their audience the methodological disputes. Here's why the thesis survives anyway, and I want to be specific rather than general. Both of those estimates are built from aggregate fund cash flows. They can measure the timing and the size of money moving into and out of funds. They cannot see who made any given transaction or why. So the person who liquidated in March after losing a job may well be somewhere in those flows. The data simply cannot pick that redemption out or tell it apart from panic, rebalancing, a retirement withdrawal, or an ordinary cash need. And it says nothing at all about the people who never accumulated a position to miss time in the first place because their savings rate never gave them one. Richard Fuscone did not make a timing error. He made a liability error, and the timing was chosen for him by a bankruptcy calendar. That failure mode is invisible to a study of fund flows, and it is the failure mode that actually removes people from the game permanently. On the cash drag, the honest answer is to price it rather than deny it. Housel's own framing is the right one. If that cash prevents a large enough forced sale and a bad enough drawdown, the avoided loss can repay a meaningful part of its opportunity cost, potentially all of it. That is a possibility, not a guarantee, and it depends on the size of the allocation, the depth of the fall, and how much you'd have had to sell. It is not a yield instrument. It is a premium on a policy that pays out an avoided permanent loss. Whether that premium is worth it depends on how volatile your income is, how much of your net worth is illiquid, and how many people depend on you, which is precisely why there's no universal right number and why Housel keeps saying his 20% is not a recommendation. And the strongest part of the case doesn't depend on any of this. The savings rate arithmetic is not a behavioral claim. It's division. 3% versus 8.4% moves that simplified ratio from about 32 years to about 11 before a single dollar of investment return enters it. For someone still in the accumulation phase, few reasonable adjustments to an already diversified allocation are likely to have a comparable effect. So let me bring this all the way back. The national saving rate is 3% of disposable income, $704 billion at an annual rate against a long-run average more than twice that. Meanwhile, Apple briefly touched $5 trillion. The earnings headline says 38% when the number underneath it is closer to 26. And the entire apparatus of financial media will spend the week arguing about what you should own. I don't think that's the argument. A man who pumped gas in Vermont and a man who ran Latin America for Merrill Lynch ended up on opposite sides of an $8 million ledger, and the visible contrast between them was not credentials. Read built a balance sheet that gave long-held assets the time to work. Fuscone built one that became vulnerable to forced liquidation the moment income disappeared. The brakes were never the thing slowing you down. Warmly, the brakes are why you get to drive fast. The cash you feel slightly embarrassed about holding, the raise you didn't convert into a lifestyle, the neighbor's kitchen you decided not to answer, those aren't the parts of the plan where you gave something up. They're the parts that let the rest of it run untouched for 40 years. Markets decide most of the return that's on offer. Whether you're still holding when it shows up is mostly decided on your own balance sheet. Anyway, that's this week. If you're enjoying Conviction Bet, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, whatever you use. Leave a review if you have 30 seconds. It genuinely helps new listeners find the show. Until next time, stay patient, stay skeptical, and keep your eye on the quiet stuff. I'm JL Maurer. This has been Conviction Bet.